When you're working with n8n, then you know that you can currently connect n8n to almost 1,500 different kinds of apps and softwares, right? So if you scroll through their catalog, then you can see that from the popular apps and softwares that you are familiar with, almost any of them are supported. But for your specific use case, it might be that you won't find that integration natively within n8n, right? But there is still a way how you can connect to any API that is out there, and in this video, I would like to show you how you can do this. And within n8n, I now have a, not even a flow yet, right? So this is just a manual trigger. And the node that I would like to introduce you to is hidden behind the core section of n8n and even among the most popular ones. And this is called the HTTP request node. And if I click on this, then you can see that there are a couple of options. And I would like to give an introduction of how you can use this specific node, going through all the options that you have right here and how you can literally connect to any API that's out there. But before we do this, let's get into a little theory and a little, the technical part, if you will. But I promise you I'm going to keep it as short and simple as possible, and you can skip this part if this is not something for you. But I believe that it is or kind of helpful if you understand the meaning behind all of this before jumping into the actual configuration. So the very first thing is to understand what actually means HTTP, right? So what is an HTTP request? And HTTP is basically just an abbreviation for this specific term, which is called the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, right? And if you hear this might not clear things up. It's still as confusing as before. However, we will get into each and every one of those terms. So let's start from the back, because I think it makes things easier to understand. First thing is, what's a protocol anyway? A protocol is basically just a set of rules that, the involved parties have to adhere to, right? So this is also something that we use on a daily basis in our natural language, right? So that we are basically following protocol, right? This is just the same term. And we'll take a look into what this could actually look like within the context of HTTP in a second. Now, the term transfer is actually self-explanatory, right? So apparently there is some kind of information that is being transferred from one point to another, right? And then the term hypertext just means, above or beyond ordinary text, right? So imagine that you read a book from page 1 to the end. That's just ordinary text, but hypertext is able to link between different kinds of documents. And this is something that we do on a daily basis, right? By clicking on hyperlinks. This is something that we are very used to. And I have prepared an example so that we can take a better look at this. And this is now a document from the Mozilla Foundation, the guys behind Firefox. And they have a couple of guides. And on the left-hand side, you can see that there is this HTTP messages article. And within that, they have a chapter called the anatomy of an HTTP message. And this is exactly what's happening right now. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there is a request, right? And we are dealing with HTTP request nodes right now. And then there is a response on the right-hand side. Now, if you take a look at what's in the middle of this, then you can see that there's a start line, right? Then there's a header, then there's an empty line, and then there's a body, right? And this in the middle now explains kind of like the protocol, right? So what does this request have to look like on a textual basis, if you will, right? So there's a certain document that's being sent somewhere, and we are going to understand this in a second. And this specific request has to adhere to these sets of rules, right? So in the first line, there has to be this blue area, right, which in itself, again, has to adhere to a couple of rules, right? And we're going to take a look at this in a second. Then in this purple area, there is some information, and it has to contain this, right? So this document has to contain the blue area, then the purple area, then there has to be an empty line, and then there's this body, right? And this is basically the protocol this specific request has to adhere to, so that it's basically accepted by both parties. Because what this does is that the receiving system, right, is actually able to understand what's happening and what this request actually wants, right? And what this means is something I'm going to explain in a second. And then the response itself is already structured quite similar. So as you can see, within the response, there is also a start line, which is the blue one. Then we have the purple area, again an empty line, and then the body of the message, right? So we have a request and response system. Now, how is this related to what we are talking about? Well, every time you are entering a URL in your search bar, actually, so I'm just going to paste in the google.com right now, then and then if you click on this, right, then this is the request of our machine. We are the so-called client in that regard, and we are asking, in this case, the Google server to show us the content of the Google page from google.com, right? And this is what is happening. So by typing in this domain, right, google.com, and then sending it, hitting enter, by the way, hitting enter just means that we are sending a request to a specific server asking if they would please show us the content of the Google page, right? And the response we get back actually then contains within the body the actual content of the Google page, i.e. we get the links in the top left, we get the logo, we get the search bar, and everything else that contains this specific page, right? And this obviously counts for every website that is out there, right? So if I'm going to take a different example other than Google, And I found this article right here. So let's take this, right? So LLMs predict my coffee. Then this is an article page, right? And it is getting into a lot more detail in regards to, this specific topic. And what we are able to do right now is to take a look behind the scenes, if you will, and then we will see how this is related to our HTTP request. Because what I can do is that I can click with my mouse into any area of that page, and then I can go into the inspect modus. And if I do this, then you can see it on the bottom of my screen that I'm basically now able to see the code behind this specific page, right? And you can see that this is written in HTML, and then there's a lot of information, right? And if I hover over all of these elements, then these are basically being represented by their visual counterpart on the page, right? So what the browser itself does is that it interprets this HTML code into this visual form that we are used to, right? Now, what this means is that if I take this URL right here and I go into n8n and I jump into this HTTP request node, so when I'm in the settings, I jump into the node itself, and then within the URL field, I'm going to paste in the URL that we have right here. Then I'm going to execute the step. Then now you can see that on the right-hand side that this is basically exactly the whole page, right, of this specific code that we can see right here, right? So what we are retrieving, or what we are receiving by the responding system, right, by the server where this specific page is hosted, is to get this complete code, which is representing this very page, right? So if I jump into this, then you can see that this is basically the start of the whole code of that whole page. So we are basically able to get that whole page, if you will, including images, including color schemes, including whatever you can imagine, right, into our n8n flow. So if we switch from the schema into the table view, then you can actually see the complete document, right? So the complete code behind this specific page. And this is how the HTTP request node works in the background. So what we have done by entering the URL right here and then clicking on execute step is actually nothing but using the URL bar within our browser and then getting back the result it displays. And this is how those HTTP requests basically work in general. Now, what we want to do is now to take this a step further, right? Because what we want to do is not to get the, generic information from the complete page or from a complete site, right, or a platform. But what we want to do is to use dedicated endpoints, right? And this is where APIs come in, to specific functionalities a provider gives us, right? And this requires us to add more information to this specific node. However, at the end of the day, from a technical point of view, this is nothing but the same that we just did, which is also an HTTP request, right? But we would need to give it a little more information, and we would need to add authentication and all of this, and we will get to that in a second. But essentially, it's exactly the same thing like this generic HTTP request. So what I have done now is that I have looked for a specific service that does not have a native integration within n8n, but it still offers an API, right? Because remember, APIs are not, solely for n8n users like ourselves, right? But these are, gateways into using the functionality of a service in general, right? So everybody can use this. Every developer can use this. Every, vibe coder basically can use this, right? If you have the access to it and are allowed to do this. So what I am going to do is to close this right now, and I'm going to look for a specific software called Bouncer. And this is now, as you can see, not within the portfolio catalog of n8n, right? Because if I go on to their website, usebouncer.com, then first of all, what is this actually? This is a platform which allows you to verify email addresses, right? And I like to take the sample because it's an easy use case, right? So this is something that is quite valuable also, right? If you are having issues with, having a couple of leads that you want to send out emails to, then you want to be sure that the email addresses that you have within your lead list are actually still legitimate, right? And this is a service which can provide that. So it's basically an email verification platform. And the way this works is that you send an email to that specific platform, and then they will basically give you a scoring, right? So if they basically tell you if it's still valid or it's not valid anymore or it's risky, whatever, right? So this is what this platform does. Now, they have an API, right? And if I jump into their API docs, and you can see this from the URL right here, so, right? So this is docs and then usebouncer.com. Then first of all, they have an API reference, and these are usually, if you are familiar with reading API docs and API references, always from a layout point of view, always the same. So on the left-hand sidebar, you have access to each and every one of those endpoints, right? Then in the middle, you have an explanation of what this specific endpoint actually does. And then on the right-hand side, most of the time, you are able to take a look into different kinds of programming languages, how you can access their service using that API, what that means, and then also what the responses would look like, right? And most of the time, obviously, the most interesting one is the 200 responses code, which basically means that it was successful, and then you get a response back, right? And we now know what requests and responses are, because this is also literally what's happening in regards to the HTTP request. So let's say, just as an example, that this is what I want to do, which is to check my available credits, right? So every email that I want to verify needs credit or costs credits, right? And I can top them up, and then I am able to check for my credits what the available credits are still left in my account, right? And this is an endpoint that I can use. And when you look at these documentations, then this already gives you all the information that you need within, I'm going to jump back into n8n, within the HTTP request node. Because if I open this up again, then you can see that there are a couple of settings, and depending on what endpoint I am trying to reach and get information out of, then some of these might be necessary, other might not. But let's take this very example. So I'm going to jump into the bouncer docs again, and let's say that I want to check the available credits I have. And here you can first of all already see, and you can even see this on the left hand side, that there are these colored methods, right? And it might look familiar to you already, because there are basically 4 different kinds of methods that you need to be aware of. And the most common one is the get request, right? So the get method. And then another one is to use the post method. Then we have delete, and then there's also update or patch, which is called, we don't have this right here, but these are basically the 4, basic operators that allow you to manipulate data. There's this principle in programming which is called CRUD, C-R-U-D, which stands for create, read, update, and delete. And these are exactly the 4 methods that we are also able to use within those API requests, right? And if I just want to get data, for instance, in this case, I don't want to, send data over or manipulate something or delete something, but what I want to know is just how many available credits do I have left within my account. Then this would be a get request, right? And the API docs will tell you, as you can see, what kind of request you need, what kind of method. And if I jump back into n8n, into the HTTP request node, then you can see that these are exactly the methods that are available to you, right? So you have the get, you have the post, you have put, and you have delete. And there are a couple of others. We don't get into these right now. That's not necessary, but you have at least those 4. So depending on what type of endpoint you are trying to reach, what you actually want to do using that API, you will get that specific information out of the API docs themselves. So if I jump back into n8n, and then you can see that I have to choose the method, then what I want to choose for this specific node, for this example, is just to keep it on the get request, right? Or to keep it on the get method, and then this will suffice for this specific endpoint. Jumping back into n8n, now again, I need a URL, right? So which URL do I want to reach, right? And now, this time, I don't want to get a specific article, or I don't want to get the whole HTML doc, right, from that website. But what I want to do is to get this specific information that this endpoint is going to give me, right? And here you can also see that this is giving me a part of a URL, right? A path, basically, which will lead to this so-called endpoint. And this endpoint is specifically, or the reason of its being, is to give me that specific information, right? So this endpoint, if I was looking for this information, then this is specifically designed, if you will, for giving or responding with this data that you can see right here, which is to giving me this response, which just says credits and then the amount of credits that you have left, right? So this is the specific endpoint that I need. Now, since you need a whole URL, and this is basically just the path, you also need the base URL. And depending on the documentation and the design of the documentation or the API references, this might be at the very top, or they might be a dedicated document or whatever. But what you can also do is, because from judging by the name of the endpoint that you can see right here, is that we don't have the URL, right? The full URL that we need. But in most cases, when you look at the right-hand side, and we are going to take a look into this code part as well, you can also see that there's a parameter called URL, and then this gives you basically the complete URL that you need, right? And this not only includes the base URL itself, but also the endpoint that you see on the left-hand side, right? So this is slash and then version 1.1 and then slash again and then credits, and this matches exactly this schema right here, right? So by looking at the right-hand side, you can also see the full URL, but in most cases, this will be, somewhere in the documentation, and it gives you like an introduction or an authentication part, or there's a dedicated section about the base URL itself. This depends on the specific API docs that you're dealing with. All right, so jumping back into the API reference, so what I'm going to do is just to copy this part right here, right? So the whole URL, I'm going to copy this into my clipboard, jumping back into n8n, and now I'm going to paste this into this URL field, right? And that's already it, right? So as you can see from a technical point of view, again, this is nothing but an HTTP request to a dedicated endpoint from a dedicated API URL, base URL, that is supposed to give you a very certain information, right? And in this case, this is just to check the available credits. And for clarification, if I close this, and let's say as an example, you would like to get your emails, right, from Gmail, for instance, then the way to go within n8n is just to use the Gmail node, right, and then to get a message, for instance, right? And as you can see here, right, within the Gmail node I am in right now, if I delete this again, then there are 26 so-called actions, right? And if you take a look at this, then you can see that these are nothing but dedicated endpoints to that specific functionality behind this, right? Which means that in our case, for instance, if you wanted to delete a message, then this would be the delete a message endpoint. If you want to get a message, then there would be a dedicated get a message endpoint, right? And these are exactly the same functionalities that you have within a API like this one, right? So this is a dedicated endpoint to get the credits, which is called credits, right? And it has also this method. But at the end of the day, if you are within n8n, then these are, just beautified ways, easier ways for us to interact with. But technically, they are doing exactly the same thing as we are doing manually right now. And now I hope you can see that how easy it actually is to access more functionality, whether the app that you're trying to interact with itself is not within the ecosystem of n8n, or there might be a specific endpoint that you're trying to access from a dedicated software that you're trying to interact with, but it has not a specific native node within n8n, right? Because I can assure you that the Gmail API, the official Gmail API, contains a lot more endpoints than just those 26. Right? So if there is something that you would like to do using the Gmail API, for instance, then just take a look into their API, and then you will have a look, or then you're able to take a look into their endpoints and what you need and how you can conduct this specific action. All right, let's get into the next setting. I'm going to double click into the HTTP request node again, and now we're at the authentication part. Now, obviously, you can't just access any endpoint without any type of authentication, right? Because, for instance, if I wanted to check my credits, right, from my Bouncer account that I have created within Bouncer, right, where all my billing details are saved and or all the credits and all this personal data, then obviously I need to have some kind of authentication that I'm basically allowed to access this specific endpoint to my account and to my credits, right? And there's nothing special right there, because jumping back into n8n, there are a couple of ways how you can authenticate yourself. There are, first of all, you could just do none, right? So there are APIs that you can use where you would need any type of authentication because this is publicly available data or whatever, right? And we have just seen this, right, by just getting the information from this specific doc, right, from this specific page. And obviously this doesn't need any type of authentication, but obviously if you want to get your personal data from your account, then you would need this. Now there are basically two types within n8n of authentication, and there's a predefined credential type and a generic credential type. And if I click on predefined credential type, and then there are again different kinds of credential types, then you can take a look into that list here, and you might already see that these are the specific applications that you want to interact with, right? So if I was to look for Gmail, then you can see that this is able to connect to the Gmail API, right? And if I click on this, then there might already be those credentials that you have used before, right? Using the regular Gmail node, right? So what this basically means is that within the predefined credential types option, you have access to the credentials that you have entered before, right? And you can obviously create new ones. Now, the next authentication type is the generic credential type. And if I click on this, then you can see that there are a couple of different authentication methods. And there's a basic authentication, BERA, there are headers, there's OAuth 1 and 2. And which one of these you would have to choose depends on the API that you're trying to connect with, right? And this is also something which will give, or which will be available within the according documentation, right? So if I jump into the Bouncer one and I go to the documentation right here, and then, for instance, let's look into the integration or the quick start guide, then you can see that there's this basic authentication part, which will then basically give you the information that you should connect with using a basic authentication. And as I've mentioned, this depends on the API that you're also trying to connect with, but at the end of the day, this will just give you, and if I click on this, then you can see this right here, this will just basically give you another option how you can create your credentials. And if you're using n8n for this, then I would highly advise you to use this authentication part and not do it manually, and we're going to take a look at what this looks like in a second. Now, as for the next part, there are 3 toggles that we definitely need to take a look at. The first one is a query parameter toggle. The second one is the headers, and then the third one is the body. Now, each and every one of those allow you to do more specific things, let's say, in that HTTP request node, right? And from an n8n point of view, if you toggle this one, then you can see that besides the fact that you're able to choose how you want to enter that additional data, this will give you 2 more fields, a name and a value field, right? The same goes if I disable this again and activate the header. It's the same thing. I have the using fields below, and then I have the name and value field again. And then again, also within the body, I can also choose that I want to use the fields below, and then again, I can use a name and a value field, right? So from that point of view, these are all the same in regards to the options that you have. However, obviously their meanings are different, right? Now, the query parameters are usually used for filtering or refining what you want, right? And you might also see this not using the query parameters field, right? So this is something n8n specific, but actually if you take a look into a URL, and then there's a part in the URL which is being introduced using a question mark, right? Because after everything that comes after the question mark is actually a key value pair, right, which allows you to filter using that specific parameters. So if, let's say, just for instance, that there was a query parameter for this specific endpoint, then this could be introduced using the question mark, and then I could use a key and then an equal sign and then a value, right? So these are the so-called key value pairs that I could use. And these could be used for any types of filters that you can imagine, right? So if I just would like to, see a certain status, right, for a specific endpoint, and then this could be, I don't know, status equals done, right? Then this would be introduced using the question mark, and then the key, and then an equal sign, and then the actual value. And the way it is displayed within n8n, or it can be used within n8n, would be to take the key, right, and then to copy it into the name field, and then to take the value, and then to put it into the value field. And then you can leave everything behind the question mark, and including the question mark, and this would basically do the exact same thing, right? And this is, as I've mentioned, especially useful for filtering. Now, the next thing, if I close this again and if I open up the headers, then you also could use the headers, right? And the headers are especially useful if it's, information about you or the request itself. So it's more like metadata. And if we take a look into the docs of Bouncer again, and I check the available credits, then you can see that within the authorizations section, there is an API key, right? And then obviously I need to have my API key. And this is exactly the spot where you would enter this. And looking at the code view, if you will, on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a section which is called -- and then header, and then after this we have this key which is called XAPI key, and then we have a placeholder for the actual API key, which means that the header section in this case, for instance, is exactly the spot where you would place your API key into. However, what we have just learned is that jumping back into n8n, it would be way more secure if you didn't hard code it into the header section right here, but to use the authentication part at the top, right? This is what we just discussed. So but technically, what you could do is to use the name again, right? And this was coming from the docs right here. This was X minus and then API minus key, right? And if I copy this, and you can even use this from the authorization section right here, then this would have the same meaning if I paste this here, and as it would have using it the manual way, right? So this would be the same as if I used the authentication part. So if I wanted, I could just use the headers, right? And then I could just skip the authentication part, set it to none, but keep the authorization part at the bottom in the header section, and this would do exactly the same thing, which is authorizing me, authenticating me to be able to use the information from that specific account, right? This is how the header section works. So this is less about what you want and more about who's asking and how. And if I close this again, then there's the last section, which is the body. And the body is actually like the real substance of your sending, right? So it actually only makes sense when you are pushing data to the server, right? So if you want to send data over, because this will be the actual data that you want to send it to, right? So jumping back into our Bouncer example again, if you go to the batch section and then you pick and choose one of those post requests, right? Then you can see, for instance, if you wanted to create a batch request, which basically means that we want to send multiple emails to that specific endpoint so that all of them would get assessed, right? Then this would be the way to go, right? And here you can also see that this is the way to go if you want to put in that specific body, right? So the body parameters, i.e. in this case, what we could do is to take the email, right? And I would put this into this field, and then you would put the email field right here, and then you would have the actual email that's supposed to be checked upon, right? So I would just enter the email like so, and obviously within n8n this would come from, like a Google Sheet or something where you could just use the variable, right? But this is how you can use the body parameter, but it works from a logical point of view exactly the same, that you have these pairs that you can access. And if we take a final look back into this schema right here, then you can see that besides the URL and the header, which are both being introduced with those double dashes, then there's also this dash dash and then data. And everything that comes after this data is the actual body, is the so-called payload, right, that you need to send it to, that you want to create. And as I've mentioned, this in most cases is relevant if you want to send over data using the post method. All right, so this was already it. Let's jump back into n8n and close this again. And just as a quick recap, we are not going to get into the options because this could get a little more too complex, right? Or a little too complex in this regard. But as you can see, if there is no native integration from a specific software that you're trying to interact with, or there is a native integration, but the specific endpoint that you would like to use does exist, and you can check this up in their API reference and docs, but it is not being integrated into n8n, then the HTTP request gives you all the necessary tools that you basically need to conduct this manual API request. And finally, there's one more tip that I would like to show you, which eases up a lot of all these settings that we just had to go through and to conduct if we actually want to build these manual API requests, right? And this is this button right here, which is called import curl. And if we jump into the documentation again, you might have already seen that term curl, right? Because as you can see on the right-hand side, there are, and this counts for most of the APIs that are out there, that you can switch between different kinds of code views, right? So if you want to use a specific endpoint like this one, then you can basically choose between different kinds of programming languages that this specific option or using this specific endpoint would be the template for, right? So if you want to use JavaScript, then you would use this template. If you want to use Python, then you would use this template. But at the end of the day, all of them do the same, which is interacting with this specific endpoint. Now, one of the most popular one is the curl option. And we have already talked about this, right, in regards to the specific parameters that we are able to add. But what you can also do is to take this and just copy it into your clipboard and then jump back into n8n, click on this import curl button, and then you can literally just paste the whole code into this field right here. And before I click on import, let's take a look into the settings that we currently have. So let me just delete the whole URL, right? So this is now the blank schema, if you will. And if I click on import curl and I paste this here and I click on import, then now you can see that all the necessary settings have just been set for this specific endpoint, you know. So the method has been changed, the URL has been entered, the headers is now the headers section is now activated, right? And now you can see what it actually does, right? So it did pre-populated the header section with the API key and just used a placeholder for the value, right? So this would be the option where we don't use the authentication part from n8n, which I would not advise you again, but you know, technically you can do this. And then also in regards to the body, right, that it also pre-filled the complete settings, right, and use the placeholders for this. You would just need to replace all of this with their actual values, right? And this eases up the whole process by just, you know, copy and pasting everything there is. And you might be mad at me right now because you might think, why didn't he tell me that before? So we didn't have to go through all of this. But I think it's important that you actually understand what's happening behind the scenes, because if you do and you get more familiar with reading API references, reading API docs, then this just opens the whole world to you, right? Because you can now interact with and connect to any kind of platform that is out there that does offer an API. And now you can actually integrate this into your n8n flows. All right, so hope this was helpful. Thanks a lot for attention. Hope to see you next time, and see ya. Bye.